Okay, we're off now.
So it's my great pleasure to introduce Duncan Bowie. I think some of you will know Duncan really, really well. For people who don't, Duncan mixes being an academic and a practitioner. So lectured at the University of Westminster, held senior positions with Ken Livingstone at the GLA Housing Corporation, London Docklands Development Corporation, convenes the housing group, the Highbury Group on housing delivery, which I know Duncan's going to talk a lot more about. And he's written an excellent book called Radical Solutions to to the housing supply crisis, which Duncan's going to inspire you tonight. So please go off and read his book. Also, Duncan's a regular contributor to the Chartist as well. So, Duncan, I'm sure there's lots of things that I've forgotten if you want to fill any of those in. But Duncan's going to talk for about half an hour. I'll ask him hopefully a couple of intelligent questions and then we'll throw it out for a group discussion and we'll try and finish in about an hour's time. So
thanks very much, Andy. Right, good to see everybody. Some of you I know, many of you I don't know, which is interesting, which is good, because it means I can reach some further people. I mean, I've been a member of the Labour Housing Group since it was actually founded. I was on the first elected executive and involved in the London Labour Housing Group at various stages, but I was politically restricted for quite a long time for a lot of jobs, but it's nice to be able to participate in LHG again. As Andy said, I've had a number of jobs. I mean, when I was at the Housing Corporation, I was in charge of the investment programme for London, for the London region of the Housing Corporation. That was in the 1990s when the Housing Corporation actually spent most of its money on social rent, which it hasn't really done since. And when I worked for Ken Livingstone, the Mayor of London, I was lead on the housing aspects of the London plan. After I left City Hall, I've been teaching in universities for 10 years and are now still doing some lecturing at the Bartlett School of Planning at UCL. But after I left City Hall in 2007 and went sort of into academia, myself and some colleagues decided to set up a sort of professional housing policy network called the Highbury Group on Housing Delivery. It's got the name Highbury in it, which we've left there so people, so for consistency, because at that time I was teaching at London Metropolitan University out of an office in Highbury Grove in Islington. So that explains the rather odd name of the group. What the group is, it consists of academics and practitioners, only those engaged academics, that people dealing with real issues, not all those sort of buried away in obscure theory, which so much of academia is these days, but also bringing in very experienced practitioners, senior ex-civil servants and people who worked in local government and sort of semi-retired or retired, together with people from existing policy groups such as the Chartered Institute of Housing, the Royal Town Planning Institute, various think tanks and so forth. We've now been running for, believe it or not, 17 years, meeting every 6 weeks. We met online, so we met in person until the pandemic and then went online, which means we get actually in attendance from people not London based, which is actually quite good, although we tend to see each other for a drink once a year, that's about it. But we've actually had 129 meetings in that period. And what I've done is put on the chat the link to the Highbury Group website, which has got, as I say, 17 years worth of policy papers, research papers, response to government consultation papers, House of Lords and House of Commons select committees, and also research presentations we've had either from members of the groups or people outside of the groups. In the year running up to the general election, we organised a series of meetings of Highbury Group members and others with Matt Pennycook when he was Shadow Minister, to try and feed into Labour thinking and to feed into the manifesto. This March, we launched in the House of Commons with Rachel Blake, who many of you know from Labour Housing Group, a set of briefing papers And if you go into the website that I put in the chat, you'll see both a summary briefing paper and 16 detailed briefing papers written by a range of people. I did 5 of them, but there's another 10 or 11 people who were involved. And what I'm going to do quickly is talk through the policy ideas that we've got on well, basically on 8 key issues. So this is going to be quite a lot to cover in the time. Firstly, housing needs and housing targets, then strategic planning, then the issue of funding, land, the private rented sector, owner occupation, issues relating to effective use of the existing stock, and finally taxation. And in a sense, the last one is possibly one of the most important and areas sort of generally not considered as part of housing policy debates. Some of these ideas you'll be familiar with from Labour Housing Group work, and I've been very impressed with the Labour Housing Group work, especially over the last 2 or 3 years since it was kind of revived after a bit of a defunct period. So, thanks to Sheila and Andy and all of you who've been involved in that work. I mean, the briefings we've done are focused on making it happen. In other words, actually implementation, not just kind of visions and objectives, but how we actually should do things. And starting with housing needs and housing targets, which is in a sense one of the fundamental problems in current thinking and implementation, is that we don't have adequate information on housing needs. We don't do national or regional surveys much anymore. Those working on housing needs tend to use sort of formula rather than actually evidence-based work. The famous algorithm which the government has actually used and adapted under the new government is absolutely ridiculous, because it's based on the idea of a replacement for existing stock at roughly 0.8% of existing stock, irrespective of what the needs are in a specific district, with an affordability weighted on house price to income ratios. So it's not related to either housing need or development capacity, and has caused massive problems in producing all sorts of figures which are sometimes not needed, sometimes undeliverable, and basically led to lots of resistance by authorities saying we can't do this. And it's basically caused all sorts of problems with Labour councils. And what we actually need is a housing needs methodology based on a proper assessment of housing needs, which includes massive survey work rather than just use of administrative data, most of which is actually not very accurate and certainly not consistent. But in setting housing targets, we actually also have to have regard to a consistent approach to assessment of housing development capacity. So the 1.5 million homes target, which the government has come up with, doesn't have a very sound basis. When you're looking at housing needs, you actually have to not just work on population projections, but also on household size. And we're still waiting for the new government projections on household size. You've also got to look much more seriously at what the housing needs backlog are, and not just in terms of homelessness and rough sleeping and sofa surfing, some of which data we actually have, but all the issues relating to overcrowding, basically involuntary sharing. We basically should work on the assumption that any household is entitled to self-contained accommodation and shouldn't necessarily be forced to live in, three generational multiple households for much of their life. So in my view, the sort of housing needs backlog is grossly understated, certainly in the context of London. I was actually very involved in the last substantive housing needs survey in London, which, believe it or not, was 25 years ago. We haven't actually had a proper housing survey in London since, and not in many other areas either. We've also got to understand what type of housing actually is needed. The whole debate about absolute numbers is ludicrous. We actually have to focus on housing for whom, what household sizes we need, family housing, older people, but also the whole issue of tenure and affordability. So it's much more important for us to have targets on how much social rent should actually be provided, rather than necessarily just an absolute target. So that's, in a sense, my first area, and it's the one where possibly current government thinking is most deficient. The whole issue of just housing stock with a multiplier of affordability came from the Home Builders Federation. Anybody, as a lobby to get, to basically tackle NIMBYism and to get a high target in every authority, whether it was actually needed or not. It was just the wrong approach, but the government adopted it because, they could count the housing stock and apply an affordability multiplier from an algorithm, and that was easy but unbelievably stupid. On strategic planning, this is where the sort of counter side of this is. Government at long last is moving towards bringing back planning at more than local level, is the terminology that it tends to be using, with the government now proposing that spatial development strategies are operated either at metropolitan mayoral level or at joint local authority level. Government, of course, is now moving to abolish all the district councils and move to unitary authorities, some of which will be the size of counties, some of which will be much smaller. So we're going through sort of 2 or 3 years of local government reform, which is going to be chaotic and disruptive, but actually could at the end of this get us to having proper strategic planning authorities at a reasonable size. In the interim, what we're going to have is a requirement for 2 or 3 authorities, depending on the size of them, to have joint spatial development strategies. And the government was apparently going to, before the recess, actually designate the areas. That hasn't actually happened yet. That in itself is going to be very contentious, with different authorities wanting to work with some and not with others. But we need a structure where strategic planning is a statutory requirement of joint local authorities, that no authority can opt out. And therefore we need a joint needs assessment and joint capacity assessment at that level. In the London context, it's even more problematic because, of course, London goes far beyond the GLA administrative boundary, and many of us have been arguing for a long time. I did when I was at the GLA, for strategic planning for London and the home counties across the whole London city region. That isn't going to happen in the short term. Government is not bringing back a regional planning system, but there are discussions about kind of regional observatories, which will try and coordinate sub-regional planning, but probably without any statutory powers. That's a real problematic area. And the government is not in this stage, and the minister's been very clear about this, is not proposing bringing back some kind of a national spatial plan. So we have a national infrastructure strategy, which isn't actually spatial. In other words, it doesn't actually say where things will go, other than possibly where airports go and new railway lines, but that's about as far as it goes. What we actually need is a national spatial plan linked to a national infrastructure strategy, where government is actually recognising where there is potential for significant major growth, residential growth and employment growth, and ideally the two together, which is much more problematic. The government is instead getting into this debate about the green belt, grey belt, which of course is leading to big battles with environmental lobbies and other lobbies. So it's basically seen as kind of a YIMBY against NIMBY debate. This is not actually helpful. What we should be doing is doing development capacity assessments on all potential sites, including sites in the green belt, and actually assessing site by site whether certain criteria are met in terms of sustainability in economic, social and environmental terms. And obviously environmental sustainability is not just about whether it's formally designated as green belt or not at the moment. So having a green belt review separately from a proper site capacity assessment is inevitably going to lead to arguments purely about the issue of green belt protection or not. And clearly the National Trust and CPRE and other lobbies are taking the very extreme position of no development in the green belt at all, whereas of course the private sector is basically saying open up the green belt for speculative development and we'll make lots of money and build lots of homes. Both those positions are ludicrous. We actually need a proper assessment of what are the benefits and disbenefits of developing on certain sites against a whole range of criteria. And that leads me on to the new towns debate. The new towns task force is about to publish its report. It wasn't published before the recess. Matt Pennycook said last week that he hadn't seen it yet, and it will only be published when the government actually announces which new towns it's going to go with. The whole issue about taking an RAF base in the middle of nowhere and sticking houses on it and calling it sustainable, again, is absurd. You actually need to focus much more on expanding the existing economically strong urban centres. That may mean going into the green belt in some locations to a limited extent, but so long as we protect key environmental factors and agricultural use, that may well be justified. And certainly in infrastructure terms, it's a lot easier to provide transport infrastructure on the edge of an existing urban development than it is to start on a new town in the middle of nowhere. And my understanding from Kate Barker, who is vice chair of that group and who is a member of the Highbury Group, by the way, as well, and comes to us quite regularly, is that they are actually now going to go much more for expanded towns than for standalone new towns, where bluntly the infrastructure delivery and land value appreciation stuff isn't actually going to work. If you go into the Highbury Group website, you will actually find a paper, myself and Andy Van Bradsky, who was the government chief architect till a couple of years ago, that we wrote, I think in about 2012, actually putting that argument forward. So it's all pretty obvious, to be honest. Densification, again, the government is focusing on densification as a way of significantly increasing housing output in a way that doesn't actually touch the countryside or concrete over the areas all the NIMBYs are worried and the Tories are worried about. But we need to be very careful on densification. Hyperdensity development in London has been disastrous in the sense that it's actually not built the homes we need, homes that are actually affordable. So the whole idea of incremental densification, small-scale developments in existing suburban areas or on the edge of existing urban areas is much more sensible than just building lots of tower blocks to get your numbers up, which doesn't produce affordable housing at all. Ken Livingstone, I have to say, despite all my arguments at the time, got this completely wrong by thinking that the higher in density you build, the more cross-subsidy you get to affordable housing. It doesn't work that way at all, because the unit costs, the higher you go, put the prices up. And as many of us know, you get very little cross-subsidy, if any, out of the high-rise developments. And if you get any at all, it tends to go into shared ownership rather than social rent anyway. The government is beginning to think seriously about its infrastructure strategy. Unfortunately, much of the infrastructure work is sort of left to quangos rather than directly within government. And we have real problems now of government coordination of infrastructure provision, whether it's schools or hospitals or transport provision, even for medium-sized developments. And we are getting major new developments without adequate infrastructure, or in some cases, developments held up because the adequate infrastructure isn't there. So getting infrastructure planning and funding together with spatial planning at national, regional and sub-regional level is critical. Moving on to funding, there's been a widespread assumption that planning is the problem. Planning is not the problem. 90% of planning applications roughly are approved. A lot of them bluntly shouldn't be approved, but they tend to be. There's a massive backlog of planning consents which are undeliverable because the schemes aren't actually viable in the current market. In many cases, the affordable housing arrangements on planning consents are not implemented because the developers claim it's no longer viable because costs have gone up. And then we also, as many of you will know, have the ridiculous situation of schemes that are completed under Section 106 agreements. No housing association will touch them with a barge pole because they can't afford to manage them. When I wrote the City Hall guidance on this in 2004-05, the whole deal on Section 106 is you only did a deal with a planning again agreement on affordable housing if there was actually a housing association party to the agreement, and that the housing should be transferred to the housing association at no capital cost. That doesn't seem to be how most Section 106 agreements have been drafted. So having said that, what is critical is the level of public sector funding. The government announcement of 39 billion over the next 10 years it is marginal progress, I have to say. We've obviously got 2 general elections before that 10 years ends, and it does look like the profile of the new investment will be very much backloaded. In other words, it will take some time to get to that sort of 4 billion a year average. Centre for Cities and others have done calculations on what the social rent requirement would be. In my view, at current costs, that is, if you can't suppress land costs more, you need actually 15 to 20 billion a year. Now, the government has announced that 60% of the new programme will be for social rent. In my view, it should be 100%. I'll explain that in a minute. London is apparently going to get a 30% share without getting in too much of a regional debate. If you look at what the data we've got on housing needs, London and costs, London's share would be much higher. For a number of years, I was on the government committee which actually calculated the regional distribution of funds in the days that actually worked on a housing needs basis. And at one stage, the London share was over 40%. And in fact, the London and South East share was around about 70%. I mean, a regional policy would lead to more investment in other parts of the country, I agree. But in terms of the current location of housing needs, so far as we know, the London share, London and South East share probably should be somewhat higher. The point I'm going to make on funding, why I'm saying 100% for social rent, the government, in my view, should not be funding any form of home ownership out of taxation, even shared ownership. You know, you can do equity stakes on shared ownership, but the whole idea of a grant to shared owners just means that the value of government subsidy is capitalised by an individual or a corporate body. We should not be using public subsidy, taxpayers' money, as we call it, for individual or corporate financial gain and asset appreciation, full stop. I mean, that's been my view for many, many years. When I was at the Housing Corporation, about 80 to 90% was going into social rent, with a bit of, as I say, the rest going to shared ownership. But even that, I think, it probably wasn't justified at the time. Ministers always try and satisfy a whole range of groups. Matt Pennycook has said that there still is a need. There is still demand for shared ownership. Well, of course there is. There is demand for subsidy so people can be homeowners by the people, by people on the margins. But if you just put money into home ownership market, it just inflates demand. All the evidence shows that it doesn't significantly increase supply by the house builders. And in effect, what you end up doing is subsidising house builder profit, which is what happened basically under the Help to Buy regime. Lots of government money just led to, bailed out the developers when the market was poor. It would have been much better if the actual market had actually fallen and house prices reduced. But obviously, developers were not prepared to take lower profit margins. There's also the real problem on so many of the new flats, both in the home ownership sector, but also in shared ownership of cladding. I mean, most shared ownership in London is developed recently is cladding. If you look at the developers and the big housing associations balance books these days, I mean, one big housing association's 22 million down because of cladding repairs. If you look at major house builders, massive losses. Now they're actually being forced to pay up, which is long overdue. I mean, shared ownership doesn't automatically have to be flats with cladding. And so there is actually a case for some shared ownership market of basically family-sized houses and low-rise flats. But the kind of output that we've got is got all these difficulties. And clearly, housing associations are now having to basically put so much of their money into retrofit, not just on cladding, but a whole series of retrofit issues, which is why one of the reasons the housing association building programme has collapsed. Right, the next few items will be a bit quicker. Land, control of land is absolutely critical. Public sector has sold far too much land, often without adequate conditions on its use. What we need to do, and the government has moved quite a lot on this, in fact, the Tories did on it in the last year or so of the Tory government, is tighten up compulsory purchase rules. My own view is that local authority should be able to compulsory purchase any site suitable for housing at its existing use value. You can allow very low premiums to try and get a landowner to make the land available. That should be time limited, and you should just be able, as a public sector body, to CPO land at existing use value. So the landowner doesn't actually get any gain from that at all. The government is moving in that way on national infrastructure projects, but not necessarily giving a local authority the kind of full powers. Also, we need to look at much tighter covenants where local authorities do sell land, put conditions on the disposal. I would even argue not just conditions on the timescale of development, but actually on prices. There have been situations in the past, we did it when I was at the Docklands Corporation in London, where we actually made land available on the basis that it was discounted sales to households nominated by the local authorities. So you're actually targeting the provision to at least local households rather than to basically international corporate or other sources of funding. But local authorities basically, I mean, some people, of course, argue that we should just tax land more. I would actually argue that I'm a land nationalizer rather than a land taxer, letting the private sector do what it wants on land and then trying to extract some money back from them has always been a bit problematic. I was involved in many negotiations on this in a number of roles. So public sector control is critical, and councils basically should be buying up land rather than selling it. But councils, as we know, are generally in very poor financial circumstances. Many councils have actually, including my own in Southwark, have had to put on hold many of the council housing developments, even on their own land, that they were seeking to progress because they haven't got the money. So we really do need to sort out. Funding is not just about funding housing, it's getting local government funding back on a sound basis. In a situation where we've lost 60 to 70% of central government funding for local government over the last 20 or 30 years, whereas the ability of local authorities to raise money is very severely restricted. Even if we, I mean, as well as needing massive amounts of grant, you need local authorities to be refinanced, so at least they can actually manage their retained housing stock properly without pushing for major rent increases. Private rented sector, the government is consulting on introducing standards. The rent control issue is really problematic. Whereas we would all like rent control, you need a mechanism which doesn't actually drive private landlords out of the market altogether. Not all private landlords are making lots of money. And obviously with the Section 21 rules delayed, but hopefully coming in soon, disastrous not getting the legislation through before the recess, which of course was promised, but it will come back to the Commons in September. The risk, of course, is that of landlord withdrawal. I mean, it's difficult to calculate the extent of landlord withdrawal will be, but the only thing worse, in a sense, in the state of the current private rented sector is for the private rented sector to be reduced without any replacement of social housing. And therefore, we need to focus on how we bring elements of the private rented sector under some form of social control through licensing, agreements on standards and rent levels and so forth, that needs basically linked to the housing benefit system. I mean, I took some proposals when I worked for London councils, then the Association of London Government, to the minister when Charlie Faulkner was minister, so you can work out how long ago that was. And we put forward proposals of a way you could actually have elements of the private rented sector brought under some form of socialised control. I mean, some councils are buying properties on the open market from which have been rented properties. But that's quite an expensive thing to do. And what we need is mechanisms by which local authorities can take over the management of private rented properties, not just the poorest ones, in a way that doesn't necessarily cost the public sector a lot of money. In other words, there are provisions called housing management orders, which nobody uses, and the powers to use them are actually quite limited. But I wish you would argue that a local authority should be able to take a housing management order on any property where either the rent is regarded as excessive or the standards are poor, or in many cases, obviously, standards are poor and the rents are high, because we are effectively operating in an unregulated system. And that also applies to the whole issue of standards. We do need to bring in improved standards in the private rented sector, but we need mechanisms by which the properties do not either withdrawn from the market or the tenants are basically thrown out and new tenants brought in at a higher rent level. Having inflation-related rent controls is useful. I mean, it is ironic that on the housing association sector, you're allowed RPI plus a certain proportion, which of course means that the rents are going up higher than the rate of RPI. So that's additionally inflationary anyway, but the housing associations are desperate for it and are lobbying furiously for more flexibility, so that they are in a reasonably strong financial position. But you shouldn't be putting those additional costs onto tenants, certainly not at a level higher than the RPI inflation rate. So the whole private renter sector is really very difficult. And I think those who are actually arguing for rent control and enforcement of standards really need to think through about the consequences of that, unless there's an ability to increase the social housing supply much more fast and at reasonably affordable rents. So I don't think we've got private rented sector policy right, although I do welcome the provisions in the bill. Owner-occupied affordability. Interesting, the House of Lords is just doing a consultation on this, and I didn't quite know how to respond because, I mean, how do you actually make owner occupation more affordable, other than you can cut land costs? But if you're doing that for private development, all you're doing is subsidizing the developer. And private development is driven by demand, not necessarily by cost. So even reducing the costs doesn't necessarily reduce the house prices if the demand is actually there. My responses to this is really you can't really do much about the owner-occupied sector. What you need to do is focus on making housing more affordable for those who can't access the market, whatever level the market is at. I mean, as I touched on earlier, on shared ownership, you could do and on outright ownership, you could probably do a form of equity loans, which the government's tried in the past, but you need to be very careful about it because at the moment, the Homes England is sitting on a massive equity loan, which of course is a liability in terms of government spending. The last two areas I'm going to touch on is the issue of management of the existing stock. And we aren't focusing on this nearly enough. We might need much more tougher policies on second homes. I would go for an absolute ban on second homes, I have to say. If you're not prepared to go that far, why should people have more than one home for themselves if lots of people haven't got one at all? I mean, it's a fairly crude position. If we're not going to go that far, we should certainly have just such penal rates of taxation on them at national and local level. Empty homes, we have powers to take them over. Any property that's empty for 6 months, you can do an empty property order on it. Very little use because of the legal complications and the issues of how you actually, take over the management of them. But again, we need much tougher policies on empty homes. I don't support the view, by the way, of those who say because we've got so many empty homes, we don't need to build new ones. I mean, that's nonsense. Even if you had compulsory powers to get all the empty homes, they're not necessarily in the right places in terms of the housing need. Airbnb, again, government's been quite slow on this, but we're introducing a licensing system and a planning consent system. We used to have a planning consent requirement in London before 2000. Anything that you were letting for more than 30 days a year needed separate planning consent. That went in 2000. A lot of cities in the world, led by Barcelona, but lots of others are bringing this back. So basically, Airbnb, tourist accommodation, general needs housing should not be used for tourist accommodation, full stop. Tourists should be in hotels and accommodation built specially for them. We should also introduce a tourist tax. Sadiq Khan is apparently beginning to think about this. I've been arguing for this one for years. You have a tourist tax in most cities in Europe if you go on holiday. Nobody's that bothered about it. Why we don't introduce it in London elsewhere? Sadiq didn't want it because he thought it would reduce the number of tourists in London, but in my view, that would probably be a good thing at the moment. Under occupation, serious issue. 2/3 of owner-occupied homes in suburbs of London, at least, are under occupied. You need both incentives to downsize and to have higher tax for under occupation. In some cases, if you're a single person in a property, you get a discount on your council tax. In my view, it should work the other way. If you're under occupying, you should have an additional payment. And that would hit my household since my kids have moved out. But that would actually be justified. So that brings me on to taxation, which I've kind of just touched on in passing. Um, my own view is that we should replace stamp duty by capital gains tax. You shouldn't be taxed when you're actually trying to buy a home. What you should be taxed on is when you're making the capital gain. It also means we need to tax inheritance much more toughly when it's inheritance of property, and deal with lifetime gifts, which people use as a way of evading inheritance tax. Um, very difficult for the government to consider, but necessary. Some have argued, and it's interesting, Neil Kinnock has been putting this forward in the last week or so, arguing for bringing back a wealth tax. Um, I actually think it's much more sensible that you actually tax capital gain, including capital gain on pensions, capital gain on investments, I should say, in the stock market. But again, that's, proving difficult. A basic tax on wealth on an annual basis is a bit more problematic, actually, because not people who necessarily have wealth as assets aren't necessarily in a position to realize it. So taxing disposal of assets is in many cases a lot more sensible. Um, and certainly moving to a much more progressive council tax. So the idea of a council tax linked to occupation levels, you could do a council tax based on floor space, for example, rather than on value of, what was it, 31 years ago, which was the last time there was a valuation system. And bringing valuations up to date would be very, very difficult. But you actually need a much more progressive system, certainly higher bands, rates of tax, because that is one. I mean, we've got so much wealth in certain localities that we should actually be using that local wealth rather than necessarily using it from national taxation. And in my view, we can't really tackle local government and housing investment without actually having a much more progressive tax system than we do at present. So housing isn't just about housing policy, it's about planning, it's about infrastructure, it's about taxation, and it's about use and control of land. So that's a kind of summary. I mean, some of that is my own personal position, but most of that is covered in the briefing notes. Not all my Highbury Group colleagues necessarily would go as far as I do on some of those issues, just as I'm sure lots of members of the Labour Housing Group would be nervous about government implementing some of these. They're not all vote winners, but we've got to realise that, taxing assets and redistributing the resources to those who actually need it is something I thought the Labour Party was supposed to do.
Duncan, that's fabulous. And you've won the competition for the amount of notes I've taken by contributor by a country mile. Can I just pick up something with you, which is that elsewhere you've written that a planning requirement should be 50% affordable homes, 35% social homes, and that would reduce the cost of land, which would make these figures stack up. So two questions. You still think that holds in the current market? And also I've talked to
Well,
people
not unless
outside
there's a lot
London,
more
particularly in the
subsidy.
Midlands, and
So what I meant to say earlier is, as well as the
right,
increase
okay.
in
Can,
the
can you say some more about that?
Yes, as well as the total increase in the capital funding, something I meant to say earlier, we need much higher grant per unit. Um, because at the moment, I mean, certainly in London, the GLAs, was saying a year or so ago, that in relation to the subsidy available, which obviously in London goes through City Hall, there was a 250,000 deficit on every housing association social rented unit. In other words, the cost exceeded the subsidy available by 250,000. I mean, in other words, you need to be putting out grants of 200,000 plus for family-sized homes in certain parts of the country, unless, of course, you can suppress the land costs. I mean, in London, if you had CPOs at existing use value, you could knock 40 or 50% off the land costs on some developments, which would actually mean that the subsidy requirement was actually reduced. But we need for that, I know people may not remember this, the Housing Corporation in the 1990s, 1980s and 90s ran a cost-based funding system. There was a thing called total cost indicator where you worked out the development cost, including the land element, of different sizes of development in different parts of the country. You then made an assumption about how much rent how much capital you could generate from rent income over a 30 or 60-year period at a fixed rent level based on affordability at roughly 30% of net income. That was all built into the formula, and therefore in some cases we were paying 70% of grant sort of cost on grant, and in some cases actually 100% grant regime on special needs housing we had. Those are the kind of proportions of grant per unit that you need to get back to, unless you're dependent from cross subsidy on planning gain or from speculative development, which of course has gone badly wrong. So, you know, you need to put in the grant at a much higher level. And it was outrageous that Homes England handed back, what, 1.8 billion of money to the Treasury a year ago because they couldn't spend their budget. And they couldn't spend their budget because housing associations and other registered providers couldn't actually build on the level of grant that the Homes England was prepared to provide. I mean, when I was at Housing Corporation, if we had a scheme like that we assessed, we just put money in. I got a 50% multiplier on total cost indicator for 4 or 5 inner London boroughs because costs were so high. So we got family housing built in inner London for social rent. I mean, there are mechanisms you can operate to do this. But I'm glad I mean, I had possibly had some role in this, but I'm glad the Homes England chief executive and chair was sacked, because bluntly, if I'd underspent by £50,000 and other mine 1.8 billion, I would have been rightly sacked. And that was in the days I ran, as I say, I ran the Housing Corporation London programme. I mean, it's just unbelievable that an organisation like that has been so incompetent. There is actually a new report actually out on that from basically KPMG did a study of the Homes England sort of change programme, which basically seems to have involved £100 million or so going down the pan. But I mean, the whole idea of giving money to direct to private developers who then go bust, or funding, you know, an off-site construction company that then goes bust, so you've lost a couple of £100 million. It doesn't seem very sensible use of public money.
Can I just say, Duncan, I just dug out all of my scheme work as part of the thing I was trying to talk to you about somewhat. And I found one 87.3 for 2 terraced houses in Leytonstone that we did in about 1991. And that was the grant rate at the end by the time all the calculations were done. Yeah. And I'd said in the notes, I'd just like to thank you, because you were there at Home Council office when my co-op got started. We're coming up to our 40th year as an RP. I'm sitting in a flat now which you funded, which still cost me 58 quid a week.
Okay, on behalf of government, I have to say, it was just the systems I was managing.
Well, and we got registered.
Let Duncan come back, yeah.
Well, we got registered in 2 months, which now, I was talking to Bunker, they're still waiting to be registered in something like 18 months. We got registered in 2 months, and they built the place I'm living in, started in October, and I moved in February. So we used to be able to do this.
Yeah.
That's
my point. It's not rocket science.
No,
it needs
exactly
levels of funding. It needs a management process, and it needs a government funding organisation such as Homes England or the Housing Corporation, I don't mind what you call it, that is run on public policy purposes, not as a speculative investment deal. I mean, I've got colleagues who used to work for Homes England who basically tell me that schemes were turned down because they weren't making a profit. They were not supposed to make a profit. The government body should not be focusing on schemes that make a profit. It should be focusing on schemes that house people in housing need. That's what we pay our taxes for, so I thought. But thanks for the thanks, Martin.
Yeah. So Duncan, this is brilliant stuff. With your permission, I'd like to go beyond the hour, and with the permission of other participants. And also, I'll shut up and ask people to jump in with questions. So just to kind of keep this in order, if you can kind of show if you'd like to ask a question. Gosh, I thought there'd be loads of questions, unless I'm missing.
Somebody must disagree with me.
I'll ask a question.
So, Martin, you want to come back for seconds, yeah?
Well, I mean, I'd just like to hear Duncan's views on, you know, how he thinks we've got to this. As I say, we used to, I mean, there was a golden age almost, really. I mean, to this day, I cannot believe you let us play in this game and gave us all this access to money, and I mean, not just my co-op, which is very small, but much bigger ones, etc. And you know, we stopped developing because the grant rate came down and it was sort of changed and all the rest of it, etc. But I mean, it was such a successful regime. I'd never really understood why it was sort of wound up. I mean, was it just purely this idea of moving towards a market rather than, as you say, a public policy, you know, for the better good, you know, part of it's infrastructure, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, as I say, the fall actually started. I mean, you can trace right to buy and deregulation back to the Tory government and Margaret Thatcher, but the actual change in the funding regime actually was at the end of Labour. And what they introduced was a mechanism by which you could only bid for funding if you were very big. There was a minimum threshold. I think it was 10 million or so. So all the small associations and co-ops got squeezed out totally. Some of the medium associations had to merge, and even some of the bigger associations merged, depending on whether the threshold operated at regional or national level. This is when the Housing Corporation was still a regional organisation before the London package went across to City Hall, which happened a bit later. They also introduced what was called the cash programme system. Some of you may remember this, but if you were big enough and past the threshold, you could bid for a programme which is across the region as a whole, specifying a number of units for the minimum amount of grant that you thought you could do it with. So basically, New Labour got very greedy, and basically a lot of the big associations bid for scheme underbid, and therefore the schemes weren't deliverable. Some actually made vast amounts of money out of it, because they then sort of bought in the cheaper areas within the region. So, you know, in the regime before then, everything was local authority based. The site was agreed with the local authority. The housing association was agreed with the local authority. The mix of tenure was agreed with the local authority. And nearly all of that happened. I mean, a few schemes fell apart, but we switched money to somebody else who could deliver, which is why we never underspent. Once you get into this organisation basis, without actually knowing what your output's going to be, where it's going to be, the local authorities are left out of it. You don't have an ability, well, they stopped checking the viability of specific sites with the local authorities, whether it was even get planning permission. And the large associations could move the stuff around. As I say, some did very well out of it, which is why their chief executives suddenly got massive bonuses, as if they were developers. But also, it meant we actually lost control over whether the housing went. I mean, I can say this now, but I mean, I refused to sign a couple of these agreements because the associations were on the regulatory sort of orange or red sign. You know, there were major regulatory failings, yet we were doing cash programs with associations that weren't supposed to be getting any money at all.
In the light of all this community development stuff, I mean, you just reminded me, at some point there was, Charlie Foreman was in the Housing Corporation as a co-ops officer, and for a period of time I seem to remember, we got a top 10% slice of the ADP for about 6 or 7 years. I mean, the idea of entry level as a bunch of young people, basically, you know, a bit disorganized, getting ourselves registered, and then you could bid and you could basically take part in that. I mean, looking back, I still sort of can't believe how, not ramshackle, but how, you know, not voluntary, not amateur, that we basically we're allowed to play around with all this sort of money and develop houses for ourselves. In the light of that new stuff around community building, that's what we need to go back to. Is to take it away from the big and give it back to the
personally,
people.
I've never been in favour of quotas, but I certainly did keep an eye on how much of the programme the small associations were getting. And I used to attend the meetings of the G, whatever it was, 100 or 200 of the small associations in London. As I also sought to explicitly protect inner London development rather than just shift the money to where it was cheaper to build in the outer suburbs. I've never believed in a fixed quota for certain types of provision because I'm mainly interested in the output rather than necessarily the organisational basis. But, you know, we funded co-ops when they were meeting the criteria.
Okay, can we go Sheila, Peter, and then Pat? So Sheila?
Yeah, I wanted to go back to what you were talking about housing needs assessment. it's been a bugbear of mine for a long time, and you've partly explained some of the things that I've been worrying about. But in our part of the world, in the northeast, I do not believe we have a need for the number of properties that we are being told, that local authorities are being told they have to build. And there's still loads and loads of land, some of it former farming land, being taken for building primarily owner-occupied housing, with a bit of affordable housing for sale in there and not much else. Whereas I know from my local authorities housing strategy that what they really need is social housing.
Yeah.
So how many years is it going to take us to change that picture? As I understand it, and I think you said this, local authorities were told basically told that housing targets they needed to aim for.
Yeah.
When is our government going to change that? Is my first question. The second one is, you've talked a lot about London because that's where you're based and where you're active, but we have a real interest in making sure not only that there's housing built everywhere around the country, but also that we do build small schemes in rural areas, towns and villages. And how do we achieve that?
Right. I mean, but there's part of the problem now is that so many of the small associations are not development active. They've lost their development capacity because they were squeezed out of the programme a long time ago. I mean, as you know, there are sort of rural exemption policies. I would extend those. But I mean, my own view remains that a local authority should decide what's needed in its area based on housing needs. In some cases, that needs to be undertaken with neighbouring authorities, which is always problematic. But if the authorities in the northeast don't think there's significant demand for market housing, but there's an absolute need for more social rent, what's to stop you setting an 80, 90, 100% social rent target in your plan? I mean, my view is that, you know, I never saw a 50% affordable housing target as a maximum. In fact, when we wrote the guidance on the London plan, we actually made that clear that it was a minimum, not a maximum, and that if a local authority could, on the basis of its needs assessment, justify a higher figure. So I've never wanted fixed quotas. I've never wanted government to say 10% of your programme must be discounted sales, or 10% must be self-build, or 10% must be co-ops, or 10% should be housing for the elderly, or 10% should be for single people. I mean, that's all nonsense. It should be an assessment of what's needed. But as I say, councils are not doing proper housing needs surveys. There hasn't been a proper housing needs survey in London since 2001. And I know because I was at the Housing Corporation and funded it before I left the Housing Corporation in 1998 or whatever, and was at the City Hall roughly by the time it was actually completed, having had various other jobs in the interim. And everything since has been done on administrative data. And the City Hall, GLA, and sorry about mentioning this, but they are the biggest geographical area, are basically saying they don't need to do a housing needs assessment, which used to be the government guidance. Well, I haven't started it yet. They say they're doing some kind of a calculation, but they don't need to do it because the government gave them an 88,000 target based on their formula, and that's what they're sticking with. And their view is, you see, if they put 88,000 in the plan, the government will approve the plan. If they actually put a figure based on a different assessment, a local assessment, they'll have an argument with government that they don't want, which just means that they can just be late, dare I say, be lazy. Sorry, somebody from the GLA is with me on the call, I think. And GLA do know my views on this. So what I'm saying now is not a surprise to them. Yeah, I mean, you should. The trouble is, obviously, if you want more social rent, you need much higher levels of grant. And to cut the development cost, you need much more control over land. But a lot of the land you're talking about will have relatively low value anyway. So as long as you do a proper assessment of the viability of the development and do it in-house rather than use some consultant, which is what everybody does these days. They use the consultants that are working for the developers anyway, which is ridiculous. You know, I used to do all the assessments for City Hall when I was there. I did them personally on a set system. You know, what you can do is build a lot more if you can suppress the land value and avoid the farmers selling the land at 50 or 100 times the current existing use value. I do have to say, though, I mean, agricultural land, which is an agricultural use, should be a last resort. We do need food. But there are other sites, you know, which are suitable for development, which aren't needed for other purposes. I hope that answers your question, but I'm quite happy to have a separate chat with you, Sheila, if you want to pursue this one.
So it's great we've got Ellie Baker, who's one of the GLA members on the call, who's just kind of flashed up. Duncan, always like to hear your views. So if Pieter can ask his question and then over to Pat afterwards.
Thank you, Andy. I wear two hats. I'm an architect, and I know Andy from Bratsky quite well. He's delivered a project for me, and I'm also an affordable housing provider, but more on the intermediate market. And one of the things I've discovered, having set up as a startup developer, is that the opportunity and the prospects of actually developing has almost been completely eroded away. Because there's not funding, there's always this expectation that one should have skin in the game, and I don't know who carries around £1 million in their pocket, but I don't. It's a very expensive endeavour, and so we're not getting new people in. And really looking at the scope, the scale of what we have to do to deliver the homes we need, and I completely agree with you on the housing needs element, both in terms of typology and affordability. But who's going to develop these? Most of the large developers are pretty much at capacity. They could maybe increase to some degree, but 5–10%. But if this, we need a far greater output than that could ever deliver. And so who would you suggest should be delivering these homes?
Yeah, there's a real problem. I mean, that we need to bring some of the smaller housing associations, some of whom have got reasonable assets to borrow against, back into the development programme. And I think squeezing them out of the programme, as I touched on earlier, which is kind of 25, 30 years ago now, was an appalling mistake. But as I'm sure you also know, all the small builders are doing, you know, basements and extensions and extra floors now. When, you know, 5 or 10 years ago or 20 years ago, they were actually doing small developments or 3 or 4 units. So, I mean, most of the housing associations that get funding won't touch small schemes. They won't even touch, you know, 10 units attached to a planning game deal with a private developer anymore. We need to get the, dare I say, the actual small builders, if that's the term, back into infill development. We can achieve so much on infill sites in the suburbs of most of the cities, not just London, and that would be far more sensible. You know, 5 units here, 5 units there. It's too much of a hassle for the big developers and certainly for the big associations as well. The government is beginning to think about SMEs, you know, whether they're builders or developers or whatever. But the skill sets are largely missing. The whole debate about, you know, the government saying they're going to bring in 50,000 more builders or 10,000 more planners and so forth. I mean, training them up is not going to be easy. And as somebody who's taught planning courses, I wish planning courses actually taught planning rather than theory, but that's another matter. They're all so internationalized now that actually trying to teach on a planning course how the planning system in Britain works doesn't seem to be very popular. There's just a failure to actually recognize what's actually necessary and what the potential is. Just focusing on everything that's big. Again, criticism of GLA colleague or former GLA colleagues is that the focus was on all the opportunity areas, the big sites, many of which haven't actually happened very much, rather than necessarily focusing on suburban intensification, which the original London plan in the days of Nicky Gavran and myself actually said a lot about. We were just told not to bother with because it was too small. Let's focus on the big stuff. So planning in London has always been big project led rather than trying to facilitate infill development. And bluntly, if you can get 30 or 40 developments of 5 or 10 units there, you know, that in one borough, that's quite a significant contribution, as it certainly would be in a smaller district elsewhere in the country. So and also, big doesn't work very well necessarily. I mean, they're not necessarily that competent. Ironically, I mean, I've closed some co-ops down, but to be fair about co-ops, some of them have done better developments than some of the middle-sized and big associations.
This is part of the problem. I'm glad we have somebody from the GLA here. Is that what you identified is I agree with. I think we also need to empower the local authorities to develop as they used to, and really become bigger players in it. But the skill sets amongst the smaller developers have disappeared because no one has this knowledge inherently. And for me, the way to really get those players back into developments and to de-risk it is to create incubator units. And I know the GLA looked at this for a while, but this needs to be on a grander scale across the country to de-risk through the skills and expertise that all these male groups have, whether they land buyers, particularly for SMEs doing affordable housing, but legal, financial, which is a huge barrier to development because no one.
So I did want to
20% of the development value in their pockets because who has that kind of cash value?
Yeah, the one other thing I did meant to say is I think planning consent should be free. There shouldn't be a charge on developers. The planning application process is really discriminatory unless you can spend $500,000 or $1 million on a planning application. In my view, it's a public service and should be free. Local authorities are horrified at that comment because they need to fund their planning services. Planning service should be funded out of general taxation, not from development, and allowing developers to get fast track schemes because they pay a bit more is just outrageous.
Yeah, so planning is another huge issue because it's speculative. It costs a huge amount of money. When you're spending the equivalent of the cost of the brickwork on planning, there's something that's gone horribly wrong. Without any certainty, not even 1% certainty on it, is insane. That's part of the reason that it drives out so many SMEs. And I've been in a situation with the chief planning officer of a borough who said these people should be developing this site, and they are the best people to do it. And the next day, delegated powers, you get rejected.
Am I okay to come in with my question now, Andy?
Yeah, good point, Pete. I'm conscious.
Sorry.
I'm conscious that Pat's been making very, very nicely. So, do you want to jump in, Pat?
Yeah, thank you. Well, first of all, that's interesting, Duncan, that you said that the last proper needs assessment was 2001. Nevertheless, in 2017, there was a strategic housing market assessment done by the GLA. And the interesting thing about that is it said that 78% of the backlog of need was for social housing, and that what was needed was that 30,000 social housing units should be built every year. And of course, the problem is they haven't done anything like that, nothing near it. But my question is really about the housing associations, because they now actually own more housing, more social housing than the councils do. And, we could go into the many problems that has created. But I would be interested if you could summarise why the Labour government deliberately transferred so much council housing to the housing associations as providers of social housing in the 2000s. And finally, how can we move away from this situation? Because I think it's a very negative development.
Okay, 3 good questions. Yes, I said that the last housing needs survey undertaken, which was actually based on asking people what their needs were on a widespread basis, was the 2001 one, which led to the 2004 housing needs study. The 2017 one was based on administrative data. In other words, it wasn't actually based on any new work to find out what needs were. I mean, James Gleeson, who does this stuff at GLA, is very good at that stuff. But, the evidence base that you're working from is actually quite poor. But you're quite right to say that that study produced this very high proportion of the backlog. I actually think they massively underestimated the backlog. And James knows my views on this. And also in setting up the housing target, you might remember me saying this at some of the public meetings, is that the government, the assessment assumed that you'd meet the backlog over 25 years. which meant that how the backlog fed into the target was put back 25 years, which is ludicrous. I mean, the original government guidance was 5 years. In the 2004 London plan, because of the London needs complexity, we worked it out at 10 years. If you actually put it back in on a 10-year basis rather than a 25-year basis, you obviously increase the social rent target dramatically, which is why you actually would, in the first few years, take the social rent target probably up to a level beyond the total housing unit target that we've currently got. So the 30,000 a year is a gross underestimate in my view, but you're entirely right that we've been hitting sort of 5 or 10,000 in a good year rather than that figure. The issue of the Labour government, oh dear, this has been going on so long. I mean, it's basically the Labour government trying to reduce subsidy, the public sector cost. It's about the government favouring owner occupation, including Labour governments, and even still a problem in terms of Labour still believing, and this has come out obviously on some of the statements on right to buy, that people have aspirations to home ownership, working people have aspirations to home ownership, and therefore if you don't subsidise home ownership, you're not being supportive of working people's aspirations. The issue about what people want and what people can afford and how much you have to pay, I still take the view that it's much more important for government funding to focus on the low-income households rather than trying to tweak the margins of home ownership, which is what they currently do. The ideology of the government has moved back to social rent, but in my view, not far enough. I didn't talk about right to buy. The government reforms on right to buy are good, but they should abolish it completely, as they've done in Scotland and Wales. But there were political reasons, as everybody knows, for not doing it, including not just Angela Rayner, but Matt Pennycook basically saying we need to help marginal homeowners, they're working class people or might be. That it's just, you can see the politics and polemics of this, but it's the wrong use of public money. The government's assumption over 20 years now has been that you can fund affordable housing, piggyback on private developments. You can use the value that housing associations have built up over years. You can use private sector investment in infrastructure. The whole new infrastructure strategy the government's announced is predicated on private finance. We're going to bring back something like the private finance initiative, which went really badly wrong from the Gordon Brown eras. That's a Labour one. That's a Labour mistake. You can't blame the Tories for that one. We're bringing something back because we're not prepared to raise tax and put in the public investment under public control. So the ideology of the Labour Party is still not in the right place. And I'm not an ideologue. I'm interested in what is cost effective in use of public money, what works and what doesn't work, as dear Tony Blair once said. Some of the things they've done have been disastrous. And once you read the National Audit Office reports on every aspect of government activity, you realise, bluntly, there's not much within government which is competent. And we had some incompetent local authorities, but bluntly, local authority provision was, in my memory, and certainly what the Housing Corporation did in the 90s, was far more cost effective than if we were dependent on the private sector. You should use the private sector to do things the public sector can't do under very tight contracts and control over profit. But the whole notion of anybody making profit out of public sector welfare provision is just unacceptable in my view. And you don't need to be an ideologue to take that view. So what we can do, we just need to carry on putting the stuff to government time and time again. But like you, Pat, I'm tired. I've been saying the same things for 40 years now, just saying them to different people. I'm sorry if that's pessimistic. We're winning some things. The government is doing some sensible things on housing. It's just still got a wrong ideological position. Oh, sorry, I see Ellie's going. I will get in touch with you, Ellie, by the way.
Okay, is there anybody on the call that hasn't asked the question that still wants to ask a question? No. Okay, in which case, brilliant presentation, Duncan. Great debate between us. We've produced a great podcast. Are there any kind of last thoughts you want to leave us with, Duncan?
I mean, just to say in terms of how we take this forward. I mean, there's separate discussions we're having with the GLA on the London plan. I mean, in terms of both Sam Momer, who many people know, and James Small-Edwards, who's now chair of the GLA Assembly Planning Committee, we need to use the Assembly members a lot more. We need to do a lot more briefing of MPs. After the Highbury Group launch in Commons in March, Dawn Butler was going to arrange some meeting of London MPs. I don't mind whether it's Labour or everybody, to be honest, to talk through some of this. I mean, all the papers we did put on the website in March after the launch. They went to Matt Pennycook and his advisors. I just got a note back from Matt basically saying, thanks, Duncan, I don't have time to read these or respond, which is a bit depressing, really. He does have some staff. I mean, his advisors are friends of ours. You know, we're dealing with a lot of civil servants, bright things they may be, but generally pretty clueless. Again, the New Towns Task Force, you know, we put stuff to them, how they're going to go through 100 sites and decide which ones can progress or not, unless they have a lot of conversations and with local authorities and do viability assessments. I really don't know. I can't see the department having the capacity and staff to do that, which may explain why the report's not out yet, and we'll be waiting for some time. But we've got to sort out the fundamentals, you know, about how the policy works, how taxation works, strengthen CPO powers, refinance local government. Everything else is marginal, bluntly. There's so many fundamentals we have to change, and tweaking isn't good enough. So we welcome some of the things the government is doing, but you know, this is the time to be brave and courageous.
Can I just thank you again, Duncan? Say it's no exaggeration to say you changed my life.
For the better, I hope.
Oh, absolutely for the better. Absolutely for the better. It changed the entire direction of. I've never had to worry about buying a house for a start. So,
so Duncan, that's been as good as we all hoped. You've also kind of attracted some new people on tonight, which is great. Josh has put contacts in the chat for 3 really good in conversations we've got coming up. If you haven't had a chance to grab that data, it's on our website. So huge thanks to Duncan, who's always generous with his time, and thanks to everybody who's joined us tonight.
Thank you. Thanks, Duncan. That was excellent. Thank you.
Well, thanks for listening, and do get in touch if you want to follow through on any of this. Contact details are on the Highbury Group website. I'm just Duncan Bowie at yahoo.co.uk. Quite easy to reach.